Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the MX Group's webinar featuring the Modern Marketing Best Practices of Serious Decisions. My name is Suzanne Martin, and I head up marketing here at the MX Group. This is going to be a 30-minute presentation today, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. So please feel free to enter in your questions in the chat box, the question box at any time, and we'll address those at the end of the session. Now, today's topic is on demand gen, which is, of course, at the heart of what we as marketers do every day. And I, for one, am very excited to hear more about how we can apply more disciplined program planning principles in a repeatable way. And maybe this is the secret to ridiculously successful campaigns. We'll find out. More on that shortly from our speakers, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. We're pleased to have with us today Laura Cross, who's a research director with Serious Decisions. And joining her is Tim Cook, the MX Group's Vice President of Client Services. Thanks so much for joining us today, Laura and Tim. Laura, you're up.
Thank you, Suzanne, and I'm very excited to share some ideas on how to set goals, how to go live and gain insights to ensure that you're going to have ridiculously successful demand creation. But first, let's get this started off with something a little bit funny. If you haven't seen the Zoolander movie, it's really over the top. There's a scene where Derek Zoolander, who's Adam Sandler, is watching his friends play with gasoline, and then one of them lights a match, and the sound "no" is heard in slow motion as he tries to stop him. In thinking about demand creation programs, I'm sure we've all had this experience. Picture this: wham, wake me up before you go lyrics playing in the background, and the team is having fun when implementing programs, and then boom, just like that, a program blows up in your face. Today's discussion about effective planning is going to hopefully help all of us. But before I get started, another thing I wanted to mention, maybe you didn't quite catch that. That's not actually Adam Sandler. So just keep in mind that sometimes when you think everything's going really well and you have it all scripted and ready to go, some things always come into play and perhaps there is a mistake. But the good thing about demand creation is when there are mistakes, there's an opportunity to learn for the next time. And sometimes that actually involves being prepared. So let's get started. So when you think about, kind of a demand creation, and what we know at Serious Decisions from our research is that a demand creation program should be an integrated set of inbound and outbound tactics that's basically intended to get to a measurable objective. And it's against what that objective is and what we're going to actually be taking a look at for success. But often program owners don't have either the right tools or the right expertise to be able to get consistent program performance and get enough information to understand what's going on and how to improve it. So often you hear about things not being statistically significant, or I don't have enough information to understand what I'm supposed to do next. Successful demand creation kind of requires us to go into it a little bit deeper and have this idea of thorough and consistent planned program development. And that requires overall an alignment against the business objectives, and to be honest, for the teams to be a lot more flexible in the approach to allow for modifications and course corrections, if you will. And as more insights are gained, then you can determine what's working, what's not, and why. So after today's discussion, hopefully Tim and I are going to leave you with a better approach to planning programs, an understanding of kind of what's required and some of the tools you can use to help define and document the process. And typically, just so that you are aware, when I do present a lot of this content to our clients at Serious Decisions, sometimes they're overwhelmed. So do me a favor and keep an open mind. We're not recommending everything all at once. And I've been a marketing practitioner for the majority of my career, so I get it. I understand where you're coming from. We don't expect you to stop executing programs in order to plan, but we do hope you consider planning as part of any new program that you're going to think about executing. So before we jump into program planning, we wanted to take a quick second to make sure that we're all aligned on our language, because Serious Decisions uses some different terminology. Now, it's not that I'm suggesting you need a decoder ring or anything, or that you need to apply exactly the way that we define these things. However, the different categories I'm going to talk about, it's important that you have different naming conventions for all of them, and that you're not using them interchangeably, because they do absolutely have a specific description. But if you want to call them something different, that's completely fair. The first one is campaign. When we say campaign, for Serious Decisions, that this is the very top level of the marketing hierarchy. It has an overarching theme. based on a buyer's need, and it's intended to drive a go-to-market strategy for 12 or more months, basically. The next level is program family, and that includes reputation, demand creation, sales enablement, and market intelligence. The third is program, and program for us, and I realize that some people interchange campaign and program, and again, the descriptions are not as important, the titles are not as important as the description. For program, they have to have an objective that's quantifiable, has to have a defined audience, and typically it's an integrated mix of inbound and outbound tactics. And that brings us to tactic, which for serious decisions, basically they're used to drive interactions and engagement. It consists of both an offer and a delivery mechanism. So as an example, a white paper is an offer and an email is a delivery mechanism, or today's presentation is the offer and the webinar is actually the delivery mechanism. So that kind of helps us define what we're talking about and bringing it all together. We kind of have the campaign theme. We mentioned that. That's that high-level overarching. Then we have the program families, reputation, all the way to market intelligence. We're going to focus on demand creation today. And we discussed that Serious Decisions kind of defines the individual programs within the demand creation program family as a set of kind of this inbound and outbound tactics you see here. As an example, interactive content plus search, free event registration code plus display, kind of gives you an idea. And it's oriented around a specific objective, which in this case, it's acquisition. It also can be with the objective of engagement, and it also can be with the objective of acceleration. There we go. Whoops. With acceleration. Sorry, I'm trying to accelerate too quickly. Then we have to think about, and what we're going to actually focus on today is the conversation around one specific program aligned to the objective, what's the audience, and then how do we actually define the tactics involved. So I promised you I'd share a methodology to help you with planning, so let's get into that now that we've kind of level set on the taxonomy as well as how we define demand creation programs. Here's the Serious Decisions program pendulum, and remember earlier I said, do me a favor, keep an open mind. These are ideal state methodologies in planning processes, and this is but one of the pieces. Basically, this comes into play. We came up with the Newton's cradle as an analogy for this. It's that executive desk toy that, you know, you kind of push it and one or more spheres kind of moves back and forth and swings as a pendulum into the others, where the energy is kind of passed from one to the other until it causes everything to swing out. It only slows down when there's friction. So we basically applied the same concept of this physics and mechanics to B2B marketing, where teams have to manage this constant oscillation between planning and execution to drive kind of the overall repeatable results. And this program performance equals momentum, and that's the quality of program planning mass multiplied by execution velocity. So basically, the concept here is that program origination often fails to align with the overall go-to-market strategy or account for the process friction points or skills gaps. So we kind of go along the way and realize, oh, we don't have the right expertise, oh, we don't have the right maybe technology, or we don't have baseline measurements, we'll get into some of these things, resulting in inconsistent performance, or one of my clients likes to say analysis paralysis, where they just stop and they don't do anything, and they just kind of go back to what they're used to doing. So what we want to do is kind of really go into each of these specific areas and phases or steps and really help you understand what the repeatable approach can be to develop programs that drive business results and really identify the areas that will help you with ridiculously successful demand creation. So let's get into each of the steps now. So the first one's program goals, and this is basically where we're trying to determine the business objectives and all of the context. Then it's program requirements, where we're taking a look at either validating or identifying what's required to meet the objectives. Then we have program design, where marketers have to define the best approach to either attract, accelerate, or engage prospective buyers. The next one we're all very familiar with, and many organizations often skip right to it, which is tactic deployment. We actually deploy and measure program performance. This is where we start doing a lot of the things inside of systems. And then finally, program diagnostics, which is sometimes altogether completely forgotten because it goes beyond just measuring the performance. It actually goes into the why of how things worked or didn't work and identify opportunities for optimization. So often, as I mentioned, a lot of people just kind of skip straight to tactic deployment and then completely forget about the diagnostics. And after they've actually put in a bunch of maybe programs or tactics, then they determine what the objective is after they've already completed, which is not ideal, but I realize that's where a lot of B2B marketers are today. So what we want to do is kind of help out here. And so what does this demand creation program implementation process look like? What should it look like? So in order to conserve momentum, remember the spheres that keep needing to move, created at the beginning of program development, each phase involves specific inputs, actions, deliverables, and interlock. So let's define those. Inputs is basically, they're going to come from other areas a lot of times, maybe from strategic marketing, maybe from a campaign planning exercise, but basically program owners are going to have to own this inputs coming in and really go and collect them if you don't have them today from the key stakeholders. The actions are all the tasks that the owner of the program has to accomplish in each phase of program implementation, the 1 to 5 above. And then deliverables, and I've highlighted this with the red circle, these are the outputs of the action that are taken at each phase. And when we start going into this, you'll see them represented in red, orange, so that way you can understand that that's actually the deliverable, because often that's one of the biggest questions is what is the, at the end of the day, what is the phase deliverable that I know I need to create? And finally, interlock, and those are the key functions. So think about it as marketing operations, field marketing, perhaps sales, executive management. I could go on. There's a lot of groups that interlock into this process. And depending upon the size of organization, it may be the same person in some cases for multiple things. First step is program goals. This is the first phase where we need to determine what context is required to inform the deliverable, which is the program strategy statement. In this phase, the program owner delivers basically a program strategy statement that's going to take into consideration the business objective. We also have to understand what marketing's goal is. So at the highest level, what are the sales objectives, but then what does marketing's expected contribution to pipeline look like? And where's it going to come from? Then who's the target audience? And what do we need to have from an audience insights perspective? Do we understand their business needs? Do we understand their persona preferences? Do we understand the typical buyer's journey? Program objective is really being able to help understand whether it's an acquisition program, an engagement program, or an acceleration program. And it ideally should not be all three inside of one program. It's just too many things to actually do, and there are definitely specific delivery mechanisms, offers, and often different touch points along the buyer's journey that would map to those specific program objectives. So we've just got to be very clear to kind of keep them separate. The goal itself, and it needs to actually address and point right back to that marketing goal, but how that program is going to help that overlying and overarching marketing goal. And then finally, of course, the program strategy. And this is based on the goal and the audience. How is the program going to deliver on that goal? And really, how is it going to work to achieve the objectives, taking into account the target audience, the key themes, the offer, and the tactic strategy. For example, kind of thinking about this, the program can be maybe anchored around an interactive assessment that's intended to capture qualifying information about a prospective buyer and share back the comparison results as compared to their peers. As an example, the program's going to drive traffic to the assessment through an integrated mix of inbound and outbound tactics, leveraging owned, paid, and earned media channels. That would be an example of a program strategy statement. What's it going to do based on what the marketing goal and the business objective ends up being? Now, with each of these phases, that might be really great, but we have to remember back to Derek Zoolander. What are the pieces that can explode, and what do marketers have to pay attention to? Many organizations create marketing plans in silos. They don't reference the information that's necessary. They're not doing a great job when it comes to working with others to get the right set of inputs for that interlock phase, they maybe don't have or have a poor baseline, or they're leveraging industry benchmarks and thinking that that's the goal that they need to achieve. You got to be very careful there unless we know we're comparing apples to apples, or we don't have a lot of times audience insights. And that's typically a requirement to determine an appropriate strategy moving forward. So now Tim's going to share with you some of his thoughts. So Tim?
Thanks, Laura. What we see frequently when we work with B2B marketers is that they have 100% bought into the planning discipline and the rigor of the Sirius framework, and Laura, everything that you're describing today. But sometimes they lack a practical approach for how to really dig into the underlying discussions and decisions that need to take place in order to get there. At the MX Group, we have developed a number of ways to help do just that. One simple example is our breakout of different ways to think about how a lead should be qualified in a particular program or campaign. By breaking out different types and levels of qualification, for example, simple company profile fit and the firmographic category, versus more complicated criteria such as an indication of buying intent or specifics around BANT, we found that we can more quickly get to the specificity required for setting campaign goals. This example also helps shape and define program tactics. For example, a more simple lead requirement, such as firmographic, points to tactics like gating content for registration, whereas a qualification requirement that includes intent or BANT might point to a more complicated combination of tactics like form fills plus outbound telequalification in order to deliver the higher level of qualification required. Back to you, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. So I think that was a really helpful way of being able to think about how to set those campaign goals that Tim was speaking to. And I think the next phase, we're going to get into program requirements, which he also did a great job of kind of setting us up for that. At the end of this, you'll notice again in that orange and red, the program plan is the milestone, which includes dependencies and risks as well. The program objective and strategy have already been determined at this point because that's the goal of phase one. So now the program owner has to assess and validate what the requirements are at a very granular level to make sure that they're achievable based upon what kind of the resources and constraints might be. So the final program plan, you're going to have to clearly document the following things. First, we have to model the demand waterfall milestones. We have to think beyond pipeline and revenue contribution. Program owners need detailed milestones so that they can understand the volume of inquiries they need to generate or the leads they need to engage or accelerate for each segment. For example, maybe a specific business or region or a business unit they need to be very specific around. The idea that you can, come up with understanding what the conversion and the velocity calculations yield is going to be based upon a benchmark and what has been done in the past. If you haven't done this yet, then it would basically be to come up with a construct around being able to do this in the future. The next step is to assess the follow-up capability and capacity. And this kind of seems like a thing that everyone would consider, but often not, because when we plan for programs, sometimes there's a big disconnect between the tele or the director, indirect sales teams or the account managers as to what the expectations are, as well as the volume that's going to be come in. So the goal is to minimize wasted spend on acquisition and engagement if capacity to turn that demand into pipeline and revenue is lacking, or take a look at potentially outsourcing that. The next piece of this is assessing data needs, where we have to look at what we already have. Do we have the fields needed? Do we need to add or change them? Do we need to take a look at profile completeness and do maybe a data acquisition strategy or a third-party data purchase? Marketers have to perform due diligence to kind of understand where that data quality, the gap is, identify what's going on there to be able to fill the target audience most effectively and make sure that we can leverage all of the wonderful things available inside of the technology platforms through leveraging personalization and more of that one-to-one communication. The other thing that we have to think about is the execution resources. Often we sign up for these amazing programs, maybe multi-channel nurture as an example, and we don't either have enough content to support it, we don't have the resources that can actually manage our technology platforms, and therefore we have to think about where an external agency can help us outsource requirements for execution. The next piece is the validation of the budget, and this is really an important piece of it. Oftentimes, individuals are not necessarily thinking about a budget applied to an individual program or a tactic. They're more thinking about it at a higher level. We have to consider here that sometimes executives get excited to go big, maybe moving into a new market as an example, but drastically underestimate the cost to do it. Or we want to do things that we've never done before and we don't realize that there's going to be a budget line item for that new delivery mechanism or new technology we want to leverage. It's our job to have the data to predict how much gas the program engine is going to need. And the process and technology will make sure that the gas isn't spilling over and going to explode, kind of going back into that Zoolander reference. We also have to make sure that we flag key dependencies and risks to the program and document and socialize them. So now let's get into some of the danger areas in addition to the one I just mentioned. If we have a lack of a real lead management baseline to validate, so like we said, we don't have the construct of a demand waterfall yet, we have to get there. So it's one of the risks to the program at the beginning if we don't have that already. And some organizations really kind of skip the entire requirement stage. But rather than skip it, and I understand why they do, because they don't want to deal with the reality sometimes, where there are unknowns or lack of expertise, we've got to flag them as risks and dependencies to success, but we've got to keep moving forward. This could include coming back later, we deprioritize, we don't take it off the table, we just deprioritize it, or prioritizing it and potentially considering outsourcing as an execution strategy for the requirements. So Tim has an ideas on where agencies are going to be able to bring some value here.
Yeah, for sure. And campaign planning is a very complex proposition, and it can be made even more so when you think about and bring in factors like shared contact from databases that might be leveraged across campaigns, which means the same people might be eligible for one or more at the same time, thinking about managing multiple campaigns that are all running at the same time, gaining an understanding of how combinations of different activities should or shouldn't add up to lead qualification. And last but not least, when you think about configuring and managing the marketing technology, such as marketing automation software, to make it all work the way you intended without any unintended negative consequences, such as bombarding the same person with a bunch of emails at the same time. This is another area where we see a lot of internal marketing teams look outside for some help. Oftentimes, this sort of campaign flow mapping is just not something that internal teams should spend their time on because it's not a core competence. What we see as a very effective mix is when internal teams bring a solid understanding of their campaign goals, their audiences, their products and services, and then partner with an outside company like the MX Group who can bring expertise for how to construct the program flows to bring all of that to life. Laura?
Perfect. That brings us absolutely perfectly into step 3 or phase 3, which is program design, where the deliverable has to be the program schedule, calendar, documentation, dashboards, typically what Tim shared, Visios, or some sort of visualization of exactly what's going to happen and how you're going to treat these individuals. So we know that the deliverables kind of are going to be along with what is the design approach. We have to think about this in a different way. There's 3 design approaches that every demand creation program falls into. Is it planned, where it's launched and executed based upon the best possible timing? An example of that is this webinar today. It was a planned program. The perpetual program aspect is the idea of always on, where it's relying on digital tactics to drive potential buyers for further engagement and qualification. And the last option is rapid response, which are typically launched in response to an opportunistic or reactive trigger. For instance, a major competitor gets acquired and all of a sudden you realize there's potentially a competitive takeover program and an objective that we want to hit there. Next is the treatment plan, and this is the most extensive, where this actually allows the organization to ensure the program tactics are targeted, appropriate, and effective. This is often where we default to what we've done in the past rather than thinking about different new ways. It helps program owners identify the components of the program, taking into consideration the effectiveness by leveraging audience context, what the message and offer is going to be, the best way to think about that in a one-to-one fashion, the intensity, which is actually replacing how often I should touch them and like oversending them email, as Tim mentioned. The intensity is really going to take into consideration a number of factors. And then, of course, the most appropriate delivery mechanisms. And it can't just always be email. We've got to move beyond email when we think about treatment plans. And the next 4 steps are to include, all of the initiation documentation, the content, the tactics, the form assets, the program calendar, where this would be basically to socialize and understand from a detailed project planning perspective what's going on, and then the ability to, of course, socialize this program with all of the materials in the prior steps to the executives, the extended teams, making sure that everyone's bought in. And then ultimately, we are going into configure inside of systems for the way that it's designed and measurement. And that includes anything from a marketing automation platform to the web systems to CRM to a business intelligence platform and others. We often see organizations skip straight to configuring, and they're forgetting about all of the definitions and the approach and all of the socialization aspects, which are really critical to making sure that we have not just ridiculously successful demand creation, but just successful demand creation. So again, we always are going to, end each of these with what is the, what are the areas that we have to really make sure that we're paying attention to, and that is when we don't consider persona preferences, a really key important part, because we keep potentially sending things that they're never going to respond to because it's just not their preferred way of communicating, and also underestimating the resource constraints on the team or the budget, and really making sure that it's not, so large and so big that it's unmanageable, but rather it's right within context and what's appropriate. So Tim, I think you have some insight to add here as well.
Yeah, so let's zoom in a bit on that persona preferences topic that you just brought up, Laura. At the MX Group, we are very big believers in the power that personas have to drive more effective campaigns. When you have a really solid understanding of your buyer's needs, pain points, and hot buttons, you can speak to them in their own voice about the things that they actually care about. And with more and more of the buying cycle orchestrated and managed by marketing, as buyers wait longer and longer in their process to contact a salesperson, this is more important than ever. If there was ever an activity to think about outsourcing to a third party, it's persona development. We believe that one-on-one interviews are the best research approach for persona development, and we find that buyers are much more willing to be candid and open with a third party that they perceive to be neutral. The other big pitfall we see when internal teams take on persona development is that interviews quickly devolve into being about product or relationship feedback. This should not be the focus of persona research. The goal is to understand and personify the buying cycle needs and preferences of a particular segment in order to drive more effective sales and marketing, not better understand product or relationship needs. The MX Group uses a research approach developed by the Buyer Persona Institute to ensure personas stay true to this goal. And staying true to that goal is what is going to make personas most effective for sales and marketing initiatives. Laura?
Perfect. And now this brings us to the 4th and the second to last step, which is tactic deployment. Although for many of us, this might be the first, where we just jump straight to deployment and results, which that's actually the deliverable for this step, program results. But this definitely should be considered step 4, not step 1 in the process. The first is to kind of create and QA, quality assure, the tactic components. So this is actually typically involving internal creative or shared services, could involve agency services, and definitely subject matter experts. Then we have to deploy tactics, and this includes all of the components there, the content, the form assets, and the delivery mechanisms that are taking place. Typically, then we'll have some short-term metrics and maybe some mid-term metrics as it relates to the tactics that are being deployed. At Serious Decisions, we recommend they're along the Align Measurement Framework, which takes into consideration readiness, as well as activity, output, and finally the impact to the objectives that you've actually set out. So keep in mind, they're not meant to be all measured the exact same way, and the tactic mix needs to be adjusted depending upon performance to attain the goals. And for sure, it's not an implement and forget it situation. And with each step, we have the risks to the program, which in this case, it's that the service level agreements are not in place to make sure that the receiving functions are following up. So in this case, we've done a lot of things, we've deployed these tactics, and now no one's following up. That's not going to help us with understanding if the tactic actually was performing or if there was an issue with the receiving function not following up, so we have no idea if it performed well or not. Additionally, not having the systems or processes set up effectively in order to be able to track performance. I cannot tell you how many times I talk to marketers that say, that's really great, we deployed all of our tactics and we realized our tracking was completely off. So again, not necessarily a failure, but it's something that we have to say, ooh, that was a mistake, like my reference to Adam Sandler, not Ben Stiller at the beginning, and we have to learn for the next time that you actually go about doing something. So now let's get to the final step in the planning process, then we'll have some action items, and we'll wrap this up with some Q&A. Program diagnostics is definitely a new thing for a lot of marketers. It's the analysis piece of it, where we're going to come up with the idea of piloting, testing, or terminating the plans that you've put into place. What the idea is here is that you're identifying opportunities based upon the results. So this is after the results have come in. You're now looking with the team to diagnose what are the changes that potentially have the greatest impact. There's a program component and a tactic component, and they have to be separated out. Because the tactic could have performed really well, but the overall program was unsuccessful. Or the other way around, the program was successful, but that individual tactic wasn't the reason why. We have to come up and evaluate hypotheses and determine all the potential courses of action to improve the performance. Validate those internally, and they have to be prioritized. And a lot of times that's prioritized by what's going to make the biggest impact with the easiest ability to actually implement. And then, of course, scoping it, piloting it potentially, definitely have a control and a test group, and you have to be given enough time to determine that there was an impact change. And often we as marketers or executives that push us, we go to the next thing too quickly and we don't actually finish out. So the danger components here are not having internal baseline benchmarks or leveraging third-party benchmarks in an incorrect way. And Tim and I could probably spend hours chatting to you about what that means. And then not having a robust set of hypotheses to work from so that we're not actually coming up with a really good way of thinking about it. So now let's put it all together and finish up for today and get into the action plan. Here is what a sound, effective, and successful demand creation program implementation process looks like. We've put all the inputs, all the actions, all the deliverables, and all the interlock inside of each. So this is your worksheet. So as much as I said I was going to overwhelm you, and there's a lot in there, there is, but we bring it all back to say, what is everything? What can I take, and leverage within my own organization? And, the one question that comes out of this is, so then what does the operational view look like? Here's a program plan with the operational views. Here's typically what is going to be involved, the executive summary, that program plan, the requirements, the workflows, the creative snapshots, the calendar view, and the dashboards. And often when we get back from clients, their kind of interpretation of our planning framework, these are the types of things we get back from them to review and to provide feedback on. Now, as far as action items, and I have some and Tim has some, so we'll start with mine first, definitely begin program planning with clear and realistic goals. Definitely make sure that you are informing program tactics with persona preferences. Consider the overall architecture prior to launch and establish what do you want to track, what are the dashboards to visualize that, and make sure that you have the appropriate service level agreements within marketing to make sure that things are being followed up on. Now, Tim?
Yeah, and I'll be very brief with mine because I know we're running a little short on time and maybe want to get to some Q&A. And what I would suggest as an action item is when you're thinking about this framework and this methodology, really think about playing to your own internal strengths, and then think about places where an outside group that might have done this type of work and helped people along this journey probably pretty frequently and might be able to bring a more efficient process to the table to help you get from point A to point B with as less friction as possible, or to go back to your earlier metaphor today.
Yep. Okay. think we'll open it up for questions now.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic, Laura and Tim, and a lot of guidance in there. We've gotten a couple of questions in, so I want to get us quickly through that. Laura, I'll start with you. We got a question that's pretty simple but pretty powerful, right? Which is, what is the best way to get started? I mean, there is a lot there. Like, well, if you were just literally starting with this tomorrow, what would you suggest the person does?
So definitely for those that are just starting, I would imagine there are tactics already being deployed inside of the organization. There are certain things that are already happening. So what I would say is really kind of start with the bookends. Really make sure that you have a clear objective for the programs that you're putting together, even if they are current tactics that are being deployed and that's all we're doing. What are the goals of those? And then try to come up with what the diagnostic piece of it is to why it did not work. Start from the bookends and then work your way in. I think the requirements piece is an easy piece to be able to understand what is necessary, where are the gaps. Just sometimes it takes us a little while to get out of that requirement step in order to kind of request some of those things internally. And the design step, which is the step 3 piece, the design piece, that's sometimes the most fun. But again, we have to make sure that, I would say, the most important to start today is the goal, and then with the current programs or tactics that you're deploying, pay attention to what's working or what's not, and then fill in the middle pieces.
Great. And related to that is probably this question, which is about, I guess you had mentioned hypotheses. So what is the advice for setting solid hypotheses when you're starting a new demand creation program without deep history and data?
So oftentimes that's kind of the going back to what if scenarios, where if we don't have a solid, kind of exactly what the benchmarks are and all of those things, it's often where during the design phase when a marketer comes up with what they want to do, they think, oh, I could do it that way or I could do it this way, and they typically end up choosing one way. Often a hypothesis is going back to what was that alternative way you were thinking about doing something. It could be as simple as that. We could go very deep in some of the hypotheses, and I've seen some very extensive hypothesis maps and that go along that. But the fact of the matter is you just want to start very simple, and don't think that just because it's simple in the approach that it wouldn't actually work. So I would argue that typically just take a look at an alternative way of doing something, and that can be your hypothesis for what you want to test to see if you can improve future program performance.
Great. Tim, a question just came through for you related to buyer personas, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about the point. You had said something about, it's not about purchase and, the product itself. So maybe you could just kind of dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so for sure. So it's very easy to fall into this when you're doing an interview particularly with a customer who may have already purchased your products and services and have been using them for some time. So the goal of a persona, developing a persona and doing persona interviews is to really understand at a deeper level what was in the mind of the buyer when they were thinking about buying your products and services, when they were doing an evaluation of their options, and ultimately what led them to a decision. When you're talking to somebody who has since made that decision and has been working potentially with that product or solution for a while, your job as a researcher is to take them back to that time frame and learn everything that you can learn about what was important to them in a sales cycle, what their experience was in investigating options, what ultimately led up to a decision, and what mattered to that decision. If you are interviewing somebody who is a bit out from having made that decision and they understand that you're calling about that product or service that they're actively using right then and there, their inclination is going to be to want to give you feedback on how it's going, or feedback on the product, or feedback on the solution, or working with the company. All of that's valuable from a customer satisfaction point of view and a customer relationship point of view, but that's fundamentally not the goal of a persona research initiative or the personas that you're looking to develop that are going to get you into the mindset of a person who is in the process of making a decision about what products and solutions to buy.
Great, thank you so much. And I think related to that is for people that do have personas out there and are just struggling to really get them actionable in the organization, what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah, so we hear this a lot, by the way. We hear a lot from people that either have done personas at some point and they feel like they're sitting in a drawer or on a shelf somewhere, and they really haven't made their way to some more practical application across their organization. I think there's a couple of key things that we would point to, and none of these things are easy, by the way. Some of them take a little bit of work and effort to get there. So one very simple thing that is often missing, and a missing step, is making sure that your personas in the first place, that there are what we call data signals that point to what these personas are. So for example, some title or role information attached to those persona, or title and role plus size of company or industry or some other firmographic. And why these data signals matter is because one of the most important next steps is to go to your prospect database and make sure that you can flag all of the records in your prospect database, which will have pieces of information such as title, role, industry, or firmographic, with those actual persona designations. So then if you're setting a campaign or thinking about campaign planning against that database, you can actually organize those programs, those campaigns for those contacts in your database according to those persona flags. The other thing that I would say is oftentimes the next kind of most logical extension is looking at things like sales decks or more above the line types of marketing tactics, and ask yourself the very hard and sometimes critical question: is this content making me, the company, the main character of our story, or are we making the buyer the main character of those stories? And if the answer is that you're making yourself the main character and not the buyer, then that is a bit of low-hanging fruit that you can target, take the insight from those personas, flip the switch on that type of marketing content, and make the buyer the main character of those content using what you learn from the personas.
That's great, very practical advice. We're up on our time today, unfortunately, and I want to thank everyone who sent in questions and everyone for their time. We're going to get the recording out to everyone very quickly, and feel free to share that on-demand link with your colleagues. And also be on the lookout for a note from us coming out soon. We're going to feature the next webinar we've got with SiriusDecisions coming up soon. So thanks again. Please make sure that you, if you're looking for more information, you can resources on our website, themxgroup.com, and subscribe to our blog. Have a very successful rest of your year. Thank you.